Hello. Thank you for still all being here. It's really been a great set of discussions. So I'm happy to introduce the third panel, which is entitled Spatial Practice, the Ambience of Social Relations. The question of how to map and represent the social has preoccupied architecture for at least half a century, if not longer, foregrounded in certain eras and receding in others. One can think of even as far back as the CM matrices in the 40s, where they were documenting the social effects of modernist housing projects and urban plans, the work of Team 10, including some of Aldo van Eyck and the Smithson's urban diagrams, in which social relations are somehow implied. But for the most part, social relations that inhabit architecture are rarely the focus of architectural design, and they are certainly much more difficult to represent than the materiality of architecture itself. In the 1970s, these questions were an important counterculture within the architectural thinking, but this focus receded in the 1980s under the pressure of postmodernism. Today, the problem of spatial practice has returned through the influence of critical geography and its critique of austerity measures and militarization, which are part and parcel of the neoliberal political economy on which architectural production is based. There is, I think, a growing recognition that architecture is commissioned by and serves an elite fragment of society, and that its success is often measured by its objecthood. But in the past decade or two, a recent generation of designers have been motivated by an ambition to reclaim architecture's social and political agency. In this context, architects are responding to contemporary social movements like Occupy and Black Lives Matter in order to address existing spatial problems of segregation and economic polarization. The question of how to design for and represent the social is materialized in a number of contemporary practices, including our presenters today. One can also think of firms such as Interboro, who came and spoke at the school a few months ago, or Raumlabor in Berlin, or Assemblage in the UK, or Forensic Architecture and Decolonizing Architecture in London and Palestine, or Salotto Boano in Italy, that all attempt to trace the social effects of architecture. In all these practices, design recedes from the foreground not to diminish its role, but to speculate on new roles for it beyond iconicity. And in some sense, in terms of thinking about representation in the social, there's sort of two strains, I think, right now in architecture. On the one hand, social is represented in architectural renderings in a kind of hyper-real representation where there's a kind of predetermined set of social behaviors, the kind of classic child with the kite in the foreground or the couple walking and shopping. And so where there's a kind of speculation of social behaviors that we know are familiar to us. And then there are representations which try to map the unanticipated social and political actions of users. And these are more often traces and speculations. In a book from exactly a decade ago, Did Someone Say Participate?, Shumon Bassar and Marcus Meeson compiled a series of practices and projects that in some sense redefined the role of architecture as activist and participatory. They outlined 5 roles for this new form of practice: challenging control, shifting the power base, the need to work outside of disciplinary frameworks, challenging the question of architecture's territory, both the territory of knowledge and the territory of action, and questioning architects' tactics, expanding the tools at our disposal. I think the interest in mapping the more ephemeral forces that shape the built environment, be they social networks, political or economic forces, tracing the role of users and citizens, is tied in some part to a desire for alternate models of practice and patronage, with architects taking on multiple roles, from activist citizen, grassroots community organizer, or documentarian. And I think the 3 speakers that we have this afternoon in many ways embody these alternate roles. So the 3 speakers will be Miguel Robles Duran from Parsons and the New School, Scott Sorley from Independent Research and also a professor at the University of Waterloo and Ryerson, and Mejay Gula from the University of Chicago and Rebuild Foundation. So I will briefly introduce all three speakers and then so that you have a bit of a sense of their background. Miguel Robles Duran is an urbanist, faculty member in the Design and Architecture Ecologies graduate program at the New School at Parsons in New York, and is co-founder of Cohabitation Strategies, an international nonprofit cooperative for social spatial development based in New York and Rotterdam. Cohabitation strategies assist municipalities, provinces, regions, nonprofits, community organizations, and many others that wish to generate socially just and environmentally responsible urban projects. Their work often focuses on temporary events, on installations, and other sort of events that activate various publics that are often not given visibility. The work creates public fora and platforms for public engagement and debate. He is also recently co-edited and authored the book Urban Asymmetries, Studies and Projects on Neoliberal Urbanization, which reviews the dire consequences of neoliberal urban policies on the city and discusses possible alternatives. And his presentation today will be social property and the need for a new urban practice, which I think looks precisely at this question of an expanded role for the architect. Our second speaker is Scott Sorley. He runs a transdisciplinary practice that concerns itself with moments when form and matter engage the economic and political forces that produce the city. He's the co-founder of Convenience, a window gallery that provided an opening for art that engages, experiments, and takes risks with architectural, urban, and civic realms. He is chair of Toronto's Peace Subcommittee at Nathan Phillips Square Community Advisory Committee, and he's taught at several institutions, most recently in Cambridge, Jakarta, and Toronto. And his presentation is called Distance Pixelization and looks at the role of the drone in shaping, distorting, and distancing our relationship to landscape and political events. And the last speaker is Mijé Gula. Over her years of experience as an architect, Mijé's practice has focused on adaptive reuse of forgotten buildings in Chicago. Since 2011, she's worked for artist Theister Gates and his nonprofit organization Rebuild Foundation, which endeavors to rebuild the cultural foundations of underinvested neighborhoods and incite movements of community revitalization that are culture-based, artist-led, and neighborhood-driven. She recently folded her design and construction work into the University of Chicago's Place Lab team, whose efforts have been to document and demonstrate urban ethical redevelopment strategies initiated through arts and culture. Through her work with Theister and the Place Lab, she's had the opportunity to work on several projects, including Dorchester Arts and Housing Collaborative, Kimbark Studio, the Stony Island Arts Bank, which opened this past fall as part of the Chicago Biennale. And Mijé's presentation is entitled Neighborhood Building from Social Context, and looks at some of her work in the Chicago South Side. The respondent for this session will be Mary Paul McDonald, who is a faculty member at the School of Architecture and whose writing and research looks at the intersection of art, architecture, and politics within public space. So I will turn it over to Miguel. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It was a great intro. I think it summarizes a lot, I guess, what we're going to be listening to in the following minutes. First, where's Rachel? Is Rachel here? She's not. Well, I wanted to thank her for sort of dealing with me in the organization of coming over here. Adrian, of course, and then the university. I always enjoy coming to Canada, but I was not prepared to the snow that that just got me. It was kind of crazy. In April, is it? Is it 2nd of April? Okay, so today I'm doing something I've never done before, meaning that I tend to give talks that discuss about the construction of the organization of cohabitation strategies and what actually we've been doing, what are the main sort of conditioners of our practice. And through that, I show pieces of many different projects that we've been working on, but mostly to try to theorize a new kind of practice or a different kind of practice as we're trying to push. In today's presentation, due to the limitation of time, but also a little bit after discussing with Adrian, we decided to present just one project out of all the projects that we've been developing. This one project somehow summarizes most of the things that we have faced. It's a project that we developed for a year and a half in the city of Philadelphia, and which enormous complexities, but we're happy it's finally over, and I'm really will be happy to discuss if you have any questions what after, that. So to present myself, I have to say that we work in a serious collaboration with, there are mostly 4 members, basic members that we are. We met in Rotterdam. And later we dispersed, and we basically continued having a lot of operations in Europe, mostly Western Europe, although recently I've been going a lot to Russia. South America, which was where our first project happened in Venezuela. I'm just so that you're wondering, I'm Mexican, I'd never been in Venezuela at that point. North America, and that includes some few projects here in Canada, by the way. So it's a picture of actually our first project. I mean, this is the team that we wanted. There are some people that have been quoted there, Eric Sungedos on the back, and then the guy with the mustache no longer has a mustache, that's Emiliano. Lucia and so forth. I mean, but I will talk a little bit about what composes us. I must say that before I start this, I mean, I think it's very important to say that the reason that we started this practice, first of all, is because neither of us wanted to be architects anymore. Well, I don't consider myself an architect, so that might see a surprise. I reject that title, even though I studied that. But mostly because each of us had a participation in 2008 at the Venice Biennale. It was at the Dutch Pavilion. Emiliano was curating the Italian pavilion at that time. We were just appalled by what we had seen at the Arsenale, which is normally this big gallery with most of the big architects have. I mean, all these enormous, and sorry for using this sexualized word, masturbations of formal exploration, and so it really obscene in terms of the amount of wealth being expended in the production of these, but also what it really represented to the world, meaning that all of these projects could only be realized by enormous wealth and by enormous commissioners and so forth. But at the same time that we were all just like really discussing and being angry at what we had seen and saying that this would be a last Venice Biennale, we'll never do that again, which is so far we've managed to do it. The issue is that Lehman Brothers collapsed, and that, especially in my case, which I had been growing a lot in the understanding of political economy, international political economy, and mostly a critique towards Marxist and Marxist directions, and I would say a strong sort of anti-capitalist front. This was quite a moment for many of our friends, and we decided, like, well, let's just not say what should be done. Let's just try to see what it means to do it. But at the same time, of course, we've encountered an enormous amount of things, up front. And so, in the meantime, in this process, I'm going to be discussing about that project in the end, but we've gathered a series of projects and so on that have dealt with many conditions and many issues. Sadly, I cannot mention any of them, but the one that I want to talk today about is a very specific project that was commissioned to us by the City of Philadelphia and the foundation, which is called the Pew Arts Center, which is one of the largest foundations in the US that funds projects for the arts. I should say that we have encountered that the arts has been a very embracing space for us to inhabit, although we are also not artists. And I should say that it has been a space that is so important because it has the openness to accept other directions, which our traditional disciplinary practices, including architecture, has serious problems to engage with. And we've also been using a lot the art discourse. I would say, we always say it publicly, we use the arts field for funding many of our projects, but also, again, for bringing what we call a transdisciplinary practice, which, again, for whatever reason, the arts world is much more open, we have found, than many of the other traditional disciplines around. And so this project, again, commissioned by the City of Philadelphia, an organization that was inside the City of Philadelphia that's called Philadelphia Mural Arts Program, which today is the largest public arts organization in the United States, and this foundation. And with that, the main commission was very simple. They found the organization that's called Philadelphia Mural Arts had been known for many decades of building perhaps the city in the world with more murals, and all of them publicly participative projects, dealing with a lot of political issues, and they're famous all over the world for that. Those of you that haven't been to Philadelphia, it's like you cannot not see one of their murals. They have thousands by now. And they started to diversify, saying that the mural was really not enough to do. Understanding was not enough to actually engage in the social issues of the city. And they created a department that was called Restored Spaces. And they started to explore a little bit with the idea of entering more in the transformation of the urban realm in areas where there was a lot of social need and a lot of social urgencies. They didn't know more or less how to go forward with that project, and this is when they called us to support them in developing new methodologies and new directions for actually achieving a much more socially engaged form of practice for them. In our case, we took this, of course, as a challenge. We had done projects similar to that. The closest one was one we did for the city of Bordeaux in 2011, which was commissioned by an artist named Michelangelo Pistoletto to have a catalog for the artists that were coming in order to show them sort of the problematics that existed in the city of Bordeaux beyond when you go there and you just see this city without any problems. The reality is that there were many. And so we did also, we had, let's say, a precedent for doing this kind of research projects, but we tried to push the city of Philadelphia to not only develop the research methodologies and the directions for this organization, but also to have already work done as we were in the process. One of the issues that we've been dealing a lot with, what we're saying, is what we call action research. And action research, I think we're trying to also redefine in our own practice, perhaps to the world might feel something very different, what we mean by that. No? In this case, in this very specific project, you cannot read very sadly, and I also can't. So the idea is that I was going to show a little bit of the content of how it works, but it will come later. It has to do with our practice has been a lot with the development of new methodologies and new forms of entering the urban space. Again, without a disciplinary perspective, so that intro actually fits quite well. I mean, we really define ourselves as coming from no discipline, and without a deterministic output. Let me put you an example. In the architecture world, in most of it, perhaps in this might be not fall, I don't know. Normally what you do is like, there's an urban problem, and you know at least how you're going to address it. And that knowing is through architecture, right? If you're in a social research space, let's say urban sociology, and urban sociology knows that it's going to address that issue through urban sociology. Or human geography, or etc. An artist through the production of art. What we try to do at the beginning is basically refrain ourselves from saying there is a specific disciplinary apparatus that can deal with these issues, but try first to understand the problematics that exist in the specific places that we're working at. And so part of our methodology, which is what I'm going to be showing today in the following slides, there's a number, I have 5 points, just to exemplify what this process meant and the type of multi-scalar development and studies that we do. The first thing that we question in the terms of trying to understand an urban condition is normally either we have a quantitative or a very limited qualitative research done in the conditions of the city. For this project and for many of our projects, what we do is actually we do an extensive, but really seriously extensive research on most of the conditioners of the environment that we're working with. It was not limited. This is the shape of Philadelphia, but we extended ourselves all the way to New York because we foresaw that most of the New York developers are the ones that are buying right now most of the property there, which tended out to be correct. No? And so basically we expanded in terms of scale from New York, trying to understand the different dimensions, and created a very thorough quantitative research. Quantitative, I mean more geographical information, GIS data, and so on, but with very selective conditioners. Now, this meant, for example, that one of our interests was to understand mostly what was coming from the ground, but also understanding what were the impositions from the top-down planning officials. We found that, for example, in Philadelphia, there are all these many independent community-based plans, and we had to understand every single one of them and talk and discuss to every single one of the persons that were involved in the production of these community-based plans, what exactly they meant, and so on. Why we were doing this? Because part of the commission of Mural Arts was to ask us, where in the city should we work? That was one of the part of the commission. And we were trying to figure out, is there an area of the city where the work of mural arts can actually be more effective, no? And so by getting to know the whole environment of Philadelphia, we started to look into all of that. But one of our main sort of directions in cohabitation strategies practice in general has been the understanding of property, alternative property systems, and most importantly, non-speculative property systems, so the design of non-speculative property systems. And therefore, in our personal interest, it was understanding also the conditions of vacant land in the city, who was owning what they were doing with it, and so on. And we discovered these amazing things within that. But just to give you an idea, everything that you see red is vacant. I mean, the city of Philadelphia is really in a very blighted and very horrible sort of situation. You see these everywhere. Pretty much everywhere, even in wealthy neighborhoods and so on. And so within that, we started to locate areas where there was more concentration of similar problems that we thought would be very interesting to deal with, but also that had a way to deal with. For example, in the north of Philadelphia, which is very well known for how bad it is, there is very strong African-American presence, incredibly strong drug addiction, and we are, well, Italians, Mexicans, and Dutch, right? Just that understanding, because we've done this, working or trying to work in a project that lasts 1.5 years on an African-American neighborhood without having a base with the African-American community there, for us was impossible. I mean, already from the beginning, because we have had experiences before, we said we cannot work in that area. So we started to locate areas which had more diverse ethnicity, of course the inclusion of African Americans and other ethnicities, but also that had a great number of vacancies, vacant properties around. We started to focus in these 3 areas, the west, the south, and the lower north, and ultimately ended up focusing on a specific area in the south. But this was after 6.5 months of very thorough ethnographic and geographical and database and so on research. And I mentioned a lot the ethnographic because this is a very important part. It's not just to count the quantitative the information that we have, but also the qualitative in terms of really discussing, organizing workshops as part of our action research to understand what was producing these. And so part of our first month's investigation was, again, an extensive ethnographic basis, and then cross-referencing what the data tells us, which many times is just lies. This is what we always find out, with a lot of the real information that was happening on the ground. The second step that we took here, which I think was a very important process and also tells a lot of our methodology, was how did we begin to focus on a site selection for this organization and how to work with it. I developed 15 specific points as a series of parameters that would aid the organization in order to select new sites. And we started to focus on the first one was divergent social spatial boundaries. I'm not going to go very much in detail, just a few of them. Concentrated small civic organizations. We're looking at areas in the city that have had a lot already of movement happening. One of the things we do as an organization is that we don't pretend to start any movement. On the contrary, our premise is to join something that already is there. And for us, that is very, very important. Because hardly any urbanist or whatever you want to call yourselves is able actually to start something in a place where there's nothing happening. And then we focus a lot on concentrated minorities. There was including a lot of refugees. Philadelphia is one of the cities in the US who concentrates most refugees from East Asia, and obviously Latin America and so on. Organize small economic activities. This was also a very important element for our conditioning. And of course, in this case, we started to look at possibilities in how we could read areas indicating the conditions of future displacement 5 to 10 years ahead. So we have these economic formulas to determine that we developed. What are the risks on specific areas of the city in order to understand how the market prices are going, but also started to look at a lot of the developers, in this case, real estate companies that own more than 3 lots in specific areas of the city and so on, so that we could start zeroing in a specific area. Point 5 was existing street farmers markets. We wanted some existing economic activity. These are not farmers markets like the Union Square one in New York, or like perhaps I'm sure Toronto has very fancy ones too. These are like, you know, street markets, not anything like that. The rising of real estate values, which have to do with that evaluation. Areas which had a lot of development pressure incentives. Public transport connectivity, they needed to be somehow connected. Many parts of the north of the city didn't have that. And for us, that was a big issue, especially when you're doing a lot of ethnographic work. And economic distress and potential for resilience. This meant that there was a high level of unemployment, but there was a certain level of the population that could still work. For example, in the north of Philadelphia, you don't have that. I mean, the population is really, there's no, I mean, I don't know how they're going to get out of what they are in, which is in a very sad situation. There was a lot of city-owned property because we wanted to manage the property that the city owned for that specific area, and the availability of vacant land, in this case private. And we found this incredible area where concentrated more than 300 vacant lots in that area in the south of Philly. And this is how we said, you know, this is it, right? Amongst other parameters that we started to look at this. Actually, all the 15 parameters that I just mentioned, these are the last ones. Impactful cultural manifestations, the recent involvement of mural arts, public housing shortage, and tenure security. All of those parameters were met in that specific area, and then we said, fine, this is the area we're going to be working with. After that, of course, we had to explore the real assets and the agencies and the practices within the neighborhoods. In this case, that was a very important thing, churches, but we started to focus a lot on the community stakeholders. And I'm not even mentioning here all the governmental agencies that we engage with, which were pretty much all of them, from all scales. But trying to map the community groups was perhaps the most difficult one, but what we started to see could be the actual project. So by then, we didn't know what we were going to be doing or proposing or so forth. We found, as in many cities in the United States, that most of the community groups that exist don't communicate. And all of them, I'm not sure if that's even possible to read, perhaps it is. You could see that each of them, this one is based on green jobs, this one is based on legal, this was in Kent, in youth services and so on, but none of them have a system of compatibility within what already exists. And most importantly, they all fight for the same resources. So there's always these fights for the same money, in order to that. At that point, we decided that the whole definition of the project was to create structures that would reinforce social relations between all of these community organizations, focused on a singular ideal, which was to take over land from the city and convert it into non-speculative land for further development, which meant the production of land trust and so forth, which we also engage with. And then after that, basically the whole project developed into, I'm going to skip that because it's just pictures with people. It evolved into a much more precise research process of that specific area. So we returned again into the quantitative and we returned again into the qualitative ethnographic models. And trying to understand, for example, in this case, the new, I don't know if in Canada that exists, the business improvement districts. Those are, in my opinion, absolutely horrific for most of the population. In this case, we started to look at that, at the agencies that were behind those people, etc. And also started to look at case studies of the disappearance of many community gardens in that region. We developed case studies about it, investigated research, and so on, in order to have already the possibility of selecting a site, which would be our first intervention, which we would claim ours, but ours meaning for these organizations to create their own networks of relations. Now, this is the most tricky part, because most of the people in a community are not interested in politicizing anything, right? And when you're working in a very ethnically varied community or neighborhood, most ethnic divisions are very hard and strong. So for example, the Cambodians don't like talking to the Vietnamese, right? Or the African Americans hate the Koreans. I mean, like really, really hate them, right? Because of many already, in that specific area I'm referring, no? And so our strategy from that point on was to develop a series of actions and moments to bring them together to discuss larger issues. So in that point, once we had set up the project and so on, we took this piece of land, we restructured that piece of land and started to look at the restructuring of other pieces of land in the south of Philadelphia and created many series of workshops and started to create partnerships with all these sort of bodegas and many other organizations within that, where we were not only doing workshops about anything or whatever the case, but also scenarios, inviting people working on issues of theater of the oppressed, and developing most of the neighbors, inviting the neighbors to come, to reject. Again, these are moments for us to bring certain people in the neighborhood together, just to recognize that they are there. Again, these are not meant to produce any radical change there, but by actually organizing this type of events, we are producing those social relations that are necessary for later becoming more political and addressing the issues of housing and land, and most importantly in that neighborhood, very high in speculation. We took over public spaces. In this case, we developed a huge festival that it was not thousands, but I think close to 1,000 of inhabitants. And did scenarios very simple as that thing in the center. In order to get different communities to talk, we had to create a cooking competition, for example. And that cooking competition was super successful. I was one of the judges, so that was very nice. So every ethnic group had selected their best cooks. And all of them were there presenting the best dishes that they could produce. Many people, even within the panel, this event, hadn't recognized even that there was other kind of food. Of course, not even to say that there were other cultures with very interesting processes and ideas and agendas and forwards. And so our strategy was to insert in that process of creating events and discussions, these small political elements. So for example, we invited kids to create a kids union, which was discussion on the takeover of lands, but in kids' language, right? And they basically, the reclamation of the necessity of public space and land, but most importantly of this anti-speculative value and so forth and so on. And so we started to use tactics of utilizing sports, an ethnic community versus another ethnic community to start actually to have the aggression and stop and talk. And so forth. There's me in the judging competition that you saw. Anyway, so for us what became very important in this project, and I would say that the end of this project, how much time do you have? Like nothing, right? Okay, so. Is that after we develop all that very serious research and blah, 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 and so on, it was very important to come back, yes, 0 minutes, to come back into the ground and try to merge in my practice or in the practice as cohabitation strategies, as we see ourselves as these mediators between different processes that happen, that are very abstract, economic, political, and so on, to create discussions. City Council was there, by the way, and in the other events and so on. So connecting and beginning to bridge all of these organizations and people into a common goal, right? And that common goal that could transgress, again, the pressures of high-end capitalist development, in this case, New York developers and some Philadelphia developers, working for that issue of non-speculative common land. I don't have time even, I'm not sure if you even can read this, because this is part of the platform that we have been trying to develop as a general way of practicing for all our projects, which we pick up from Guy Debord, later from Lefebvre, which was mentioned a lot. And I should say that we should not forget that everything Lefebvre did was anti-capitalist, was a critique of capitalism. We cannot devoid or remove it from that content, no? Which I always have to stress. No? I mean, if we talk about Lefebvre, if we talk about all these other people that were mentioned today, we have to understand that this is a critique of the conditions that capitalism has brought us today. So Within that, we picked up on the topic of unitary urbanism. We like the name a lot. And we started to discuss this unitary frame, but again, trying to frame our practice in the transdisciplinary perspective and in a way to how to achieve feasible but also cooperative transformation of different urban environments that could actually challenge, in a very minimum way, because otherwise that would be too, the capitalist structures. And we have found that through challenging the property schema of the private property, a very good way. And right now, most of our new projects are following that path, no? And that's okay. I don't know if I made sense, but thank you very much.
So I guess I'm lucky to be the last one to present because when asked to present on Ambience's social relation, I was excited, super excited, but then that excitement quickly turned into a spiraling confusion. So I'm an architect that works for an artist and urban planner, Dorchester Projects, based in Chicago. Unlike most architecture firms, I work mostly in the field. Renderings and presentations take the form instead take the form as conversations, prototyping, and building with indetermination. Drawing has become a rare form of representation in my field of work. So I thank Adrian for inviting me. I'm actually quite flattered because it gives me the opportunity to speak as I feel I'm thankful for this opportunity because I feel that it has given me the ability to articulate how community engagement and interaction has influenced the built environment and architecture. So I originally titled this presentation Building from Social Context, Neighborhood Building from Social Context, but today I decided to change that and title it Building from Social Response. So blight has been a systemic problem in Chicago's South Side for decades. The South Side currently has a population of 750,000 people, of which over 93% are Black. Banks have pulled out, schools have pulled out, churches even pulled out, hospitals are underfunded, and residents opt to leave the moment they have the money to do so. Ironically, Chicago's action to combat blight has been to demolish buildings that have repeatedly lapsed in building violations and mortgage fees. This, in combination with a housing market crisis, not only has had major effects on the urban landscape, but it has presently erased blocks of cultural history, a sense of legacy, and the hope for future development. There are neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago that have been repeatedly included in plans for redevelopment. Words like renewal, transformation, and redevelopment come to be experienced as empty promises. Well-made plans that rarely materialize into architectural, social, and economic transformation for communities. We believe that creative structures, us, have a responsibility to address social needs and make available cultural opportunities for people who have too often been left out of the upside of economic and cultural growth. So just a little background of our team. In 2005, Dorchester Gates was a local artist and urban planner who just bought his first home, an old candy shop seated in the middle of a residential block in the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood in Chicago's South Side. It was a very modest one-story building just about a mile away from the University of Chicago, where he worked as a coordinator. After the first housing bubble burst, after the burst of the housing bubble, he noticed foreclosure signs and demolition happening throughout his building. Within his financial means, he was able to buy the house next to his for $16,000, and gave it a name, and invited his friends and artists to activate it. He hosted dinners, performances, backyard screenings of South Side home movies, exhibits, and conversations around place. He titled these happenings under the ambiguous name the Dorchester Projects, which is the name of the street. Well, within 10 years, a couple of houses grew to become a network of cultural spaces within his neighborhood, and friends that activated and supported the spaces became organizations to run them. So the buildings I'm going to go over are within the bubble on the bottom, and that's the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood. And the bubble on top is the Hyde Park neighborhood, or sorry, the Washington Park neighborhood, where adjacent to this bubble is the University of Chicago. So as an artist-led endeavor, these organizations are known today as Rebuild Foundation, the Arts and Public Life, the Astorgate Studio, and Place Lab, a development and planning research team through which I currently work. These four arms activate and manage an ecosystem of cultural amenities within the Grand Crossing and Washington Park neighborhoods. Regardless of the different structures and titles, we all work as a network under one roof, each playing a small yet critical role within our cultural ecosystem. Our team comprises of craftsmen, artists, educators, art curators, architects, urban planners, art historians, librarians, an accountant, a real estate lawyer, and social practitioners. So as an architect, I'm positioned in a unique opportunity to work and learn from such a diverse team. For me, this has offered a vast amount of insight never taught in architecture school or my prior firms. There's a greater responsibility to build things right, and accountability. And not only because they have my cell phone number and they will call me when things break, but because I feel that I have a better understanding of how spaces really get used. And I get to observe how buildings also experience growing pains in tandem with the budding programming. So I'll be sharing a few themes and lessons learned within the 5 years I've been working with this organization. So dialogue is critical for the success of a project, and who you bring to the table can inform your program in so many ways. We've touched on that quite a bit today, actually, so it's really good. This public housing development was built in the late 70s by the Chicago Housing Authority, and once was a sign of change in the working class neighborhood of Grand Crossing. In 2007, the building was shuttered by the CHA due to its high activity of drugs and gang violence, as well as its proximity to an elementary school across the street. Since then, the buildings have stood abandoned and continued to be a hub for drug violence. And squatting. So we should be asking ourselves, like, what is the purpose of closing this development if the problems that prompted the closure sustains? I mean, why isn't everyone asking more questions to address the real problems? Why abandon the effort altogether just because it doesn't work out the first time? So I feel like we need to inspire ourselves and our partners to think bigger. In 2011, Rebuild Foundation opened their doors on Dorchester as a platform for these questions to be hashed out. Through thoughtful, curated events, we invited the CHA, the aldermen, the elementary school, artists, architect friends, affordable housing developers, and neighbors. So what can we do to be a good neighbor? If the school across the street has had issues with drug and gang violence, then why shouldn't they be involved in the planning process? So one thing I've learned from Theaster is that artists have the ability to ask different questions, more so than architects and urban planners, and also offer the ability to bring different people to the table whose valued voices are often not heard. I've learned that these platforms create community engagement and foster individual empowerment. Today, Dorchester Art and Housing Collaborative now offers 32 affordable townhomes, providing housing for artists and community members with the intent of fostering dialogue and collaboration with both groups. Embedded in the center of this development is a modest art center built to be flexible for various programming facilitated by Rebuild Foundation and community organizations. The school across the street now uses the space as a center, as an extension for their dance and performance classes. So that's theme 1. Theme 2, I titled to Be Intentional as a Neighbor. So this is an old Anheuser-Busch distribution warehouse in Grand Crossing neighborhood that we converted into art studios. The warehouse is seated in the cross line of 2 rival gang territories, so vandalism and robbery is a common issue. When designing and building the space, we came to the point of ordering the windows, and several folks from our team were worried about security and visibility into the spaces. We looked into several security measures, like limiting the amount of windows accessible from the street, or installing security bars or roll-up shutters, but what we ended up doing was the complete opposite. We went with our initial instincts and installed several large windows along the street. And for this situation, the solution was not vandal-proof materials. Instead, we felt that it was more valuable to be present as a good neighbor, where the architecture reads welcome and trust. And, sometimes vulnerability represents openness and strength. And hopefully this can inspire our neighbors to feel the same way. The next theme I titled Content Strengthened by Context. Black Cinema House is a program that we run that curates screenings and discussions of Black film and culture. Surrounding this room is a rich library of books collected since the 40s as research material for editors of the Johnson Publishing Company, known to be the largest African-American-owned publishing house in the U.S. When you enter this space, created is this overwhelming yet unspoken conversation between the content of the film you're about to watch and the books that informed it throughout Black literature. Coming from a history where it was illegal for all people to teach slaves to read and write, the moment adds grandiosity for those who are too often stripped of education and experience of heritage. This next theme I'm titled Regenerating Pride in Place. The Stony Island Bank was built in the 1920s, during a time when the South Shore was economically booming. However, within 12 years, during the Depression, the bank closed its doors. It emerged a few more times in the 40s, changing hands with varying owners. Oops. In the late 60s, it came under the ownership of an African-American community and trust bank. This was a point of pride and helped preserve access to credit in the neighborhood. By this time, the neighborhood was racially changing from 10% Black in 1960 to 69% in 1970 and 93% today. By 1979, the neighborhood suffered developing disinvestment and shuttered its doors and has remained closed since. The bank once stood as an anchor in the neighborhood and symbolized financial vitality. And in 2012, it stood to represent the last building of a once bustling commercial corridor in the South Side. So luckily, through a friend and avid blogger of forgotten Chicago buildings, we found out that this building was slated to be demolished actually within 7 days. It was a city-mandated thing. In 2 days, I found myself touring the space in the presence of 5 demolition companies. Unbeknownst to them, we were the only group bidding to save the bank. So some have asked, why save this building, which has undergone several developers' trials of revival, but none of them could find a feasible economic generating plan. Well, we've learned that there's a value in reclaiming legacy by bringing back the sense of having pride in place. Today, Since the opening of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, the Stony Island Arts Bank has acted as a platform for cultural engagement and individual empowerment. The radically restored building now serves as a space for neighborhood residents to preserve, access, reimagine, and share their heritage. Making accessible contemporary art, performances, and collected archives of Black culture, Rebuild Foundation activates the space through engaging and informative programming. It is becoming a destination for artists, scholars, curators, and collectors to research and engage with Southside history. Coming from a time when this building symbolized financial vitality to later symbolizing disinvestment for our neighbors, this can now symbolize cultural vitality and pride in place. So that's it for the themes. And I was going to end at that note, but I think luckily being the last person to, or the last panelist to speak, I wanted to make a connection with the last panel that had talked or asked about scale. Maybe it's how does one-to-one get to the global scale? And so I would like to point to Theaster as an example. 10 years ago, he was a poor artist living in a poor community, and just started small. And I think we often tend to lack creative confidence, and lack the boldness to just do things. And so hopefully this inspires us to do more, even though it may seem like the bigger picture, the global picture is unreachable. I think it is. Thank you.
So thank you to the speakers. I feel like the other respondents that it's very challenging to, as Derek said, draw a line through all the three presentations. Maybe they are somewhat disparate in a way. So rather than summarize, I just wanted to maybe underline a couple of general points. In the terms of Miguel's presentation, what ran through my mind was a lot of the time that students in architecture kind of anguish and stress out in terms of their topic selection process, that we see that the subject selection process is actually like the focus of a practice that determines what you should really be doing in a particular place. And to me, that was like turning around a time of kind of indecision or searching or seeking for a subject, and systematizing it into a rational basis for acting. So I thought it was an extremely enlightening kind of intellectual investment in that topic. And I guess in the case of Scott's presentation, it's a very vivid reminder of the importance of the role of the military in our everyday lives. And that, I guess, actually coming from growing up in Halifax, it's not so surprising, but I guess in the context of Southern Ontario, the military's presence in the kind of micro details of our lives is sometimes a little bit more forgettable. And lastly, in terms of Mijay's presentation, I have to say I'm a little bit speechless, because The Astor Gates is always, the work of the Rebuild Foundation has always sort of astonished me because it's socially invested, but it also looks fantastic. I have acquaintances who work in socially responsible architecture who say, you know, there's not really any point photographing our work because it doesn't look, it looks very bland or not particularly, doesn't particularly present itself well, but what is truly amazing in the work that we saw in the slides that Mijay presented was how incredibly arresting these completed works are. And so there's this kind of interest in the visual that is totally locked into the social. Anyway, in terms of a question, I don't know whether I can address this to everybody, but certainly in the case of Miguel's presentation, when he talked about challenging property systems, I was very intrigued by that kind of statement. There's obviously a lot of, you could say, possibly ideological issues connected with that, but I was interested in perhaps developing or hearing how you could develop that topic. So that was my very brief kind of summary and question.